The
I know
divorce
I should have
lawyer's
told you
office
sooner,
smelled
but I
like
couldn't
stale
live with the
coffee
shame.
and broken promises.
The fire! I
Cole
started
Brennan
it!
sat in a leather chair
Oh,
that squeaked
God, no.
every time he shifted his weight, watching his ex-wife Jennifer sign the custody modification papers with quick, efficient strokes. She didn't look at him. Hadn't looked at him properly in 6 months. Not since the night he'd woken up screaming about Fallujah and put his fists through their bedroom mirror, sending glass shards across the floor where their 12-year-old daughter Lily sometimes came to crawl into bed with them during thunderstorms. The lawyer slid the papers across the mahogany desk. Cole stared at the words swimming in front of him. Full custody to Jennifer Marie Brennan. Supervised visitation once monthly. Subject to completion of mandatory alcohol counseling and anger management courses. The pen felt like a brick in his weathered hand, calloused from 23 years of Marine service and 3 years of welding jobs that never seemed to last more than 6 months. Jennifer finally met his eyes as he signed his name in the space marked with a yellow sticky note. No satisfaction there, no victory, just exhaustion and something that might have been pity, mixed with the kind of fear that comes from loving someone who's slowly drowning and being powerless to save them. It's better this way, Cole, for Lily. Better. The word hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Better that their daughter would grow up seeing her father once a month under the watchful eye of a court-appointed supervisor. Better that the last thing Cole had managed to keep together after 2 tours in Iraq had just slipped through his fingers like water through a broken dam. He walked out of that San Antonio office, into the Texas heat, and climbed into his beat-up Ford F-150, the only thing he owned outright besides a sea bag full of uniforms he couldn't bring himself to throw away and a box of medals he couldn't bring himself to look at. The radio crackled to life as he turned the key. Some talk show host was ranting about the border crisis, about illegal immigrants taking American jobs, and Cole reached over and turned it off with more force than necessary. The drive back to his trailer took 45 minutes through flat South Texas scrubland, dotted with mesquite and prickly pear cactus. His phone buzzed twice during the drive. Text messages from Jennifer. Lily wants to know if you're still coming to her science fair next month. I told her probably not. He didn't respond. What was the point of promising something he might not be allowed to do? The trailer park sat on the outskirts of Uvalde, like a collection of aluminum boxes someone had scattered across 20 acres and forgotten about. His 1985 Winnebago occupied space number 47, distinguished from its neighbors only by the fact that the awning actually worked and he'd managed to keep most of the rust at bay with regular applications of primer and paint. 3 years he'd been living here. 3 years since Jennifer had asked him to leave, and he'd been too proud to fight her on it. Inside, the air conditioning wheezed and rattled, but managed to keep the temperature below 80 degrees. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen area, its door covered with pictures he couldn't bring himself to take down. Lily at 6 years old, gap-toothed and grinning on a carnival ride. Jennifer at 30, laughing at something he'd said during their anniversary dinner at the steakhouse in San Antonio. Cole at 28, standing at attention in his dress blues after receiving his promotion to gunnery sergeant. All of them looking like people he used to know in another life. The answering machine blinked red in the corner. 2 messages. He hit play while opening a bottle of Shiner Bock that was probably 3 days past its expiration date, but still cold enough to matter. Mr. Brennan, this is Gerald McKinney at McKinney, Ross & Associates. I need to speak with you regarding your grandfather's estate. Please call me back at your earliest convenience. The machine beeped. Message 2. Cole, it's McKinney again. Raymond Brennan passed away yesterday morning at Sunrise Manor. I'm sorry for your loss. The funeral is scheduled for Friday at 2 o'clock at St. Mary's in Marfa. There are some unusual provisions in his will that require your immediate attention. Please call me. Cole set the beer down on the Formica counter and stared at the machine. Raymond Brennan, his grandfather, the old man who taught him to fish on the Rio Grande when Cole was 8 years old, back when his parents were still alive and the world made sense. The same man who'd written him letters during his first deployment to Iraq, cramped handwriting on yellow legal paper, telling him stories about growing up on a cattle ranch in Big Bend country during the 1950s. They'd lost touch after Cole came back from his second tour. The nightmares had started then, along with the drinking, and Cole had been too ashamed to write back to the old man's increasingly worried letters. By the time he'd gotten his head together enough to pick up a phone, Raymond had already retreated into whatever silence he had been keeping for the last 70 years of his life. Cole called the lawyer's office. McKinney sounded tired, like a man who'd spent 40 years explaining death to people who weren't ready to hear about it. Your grandfather left you everything, son. The ranch, the mineral rights, all 240 acres of it. Beautiful piece of land out there in Presidio County, border country. He was very specific about you inheriting. Wouldn't even discuss alternatives when I brought up the possibility of selling and dividing the proceeds. I don't want it. Sell the whole thing. I don't need a ranch I can't afford to maintain. McKinney's voice carried the weight of a man who'd had this conversation before. You should see the property first, Cole. Your grandfather was very specific about you understanding what you're inheriting. He said you were the only one left who might have the courage to do what he couldn't bring himself to do. Those were his exact words. The only one with the courage. The funeral was small, 8 people scattered among empty pews in a church that smelled like old wood and furniture polish. Raymond Brennan's casket sat at the front, closed because that's what the old man had wanted. No viewing, no fuss, no tears from people who pretended to care about a hermit rancher who hadn't left his property more than a dozen times in the past 20 years. Cole barely recognized anyone except the priest, a young man with kind eyes who spoke about Raymond's service in the Pacific during World War II and his dedication to the land he had worked for 70 years. There was an elderly Mexican woman in the back row who kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, and Cole wondered who she was and why she was crying for a man most people in Marfa had forgotten was still alive. After the service, McKinney found Cole in the parking lot, leaning against his truck and staring at the mountains in the distance. The lawyer was 60-something, with the soft hands and pale complexion of a man who had spent his career in air-conditioned offices, but his eyes held the kind of steadiness that comes from dealing with other people's grief for 4 decades. He left you a letter, McKinney said, holding out a manila envelope with Cole's name written across it in Raymond's careful handwriting. Also the keys to the house in this. He handed over a smaller envelope, heavier, something metallic rattling inside. What's that? I don't know. He sealed it himself and told me you'd understand when the time came. McKinney paused, choosing his words carefully. Cole, I knew your grandfather for 30 years. He was carrying something heavy, something that ate at him. Maybe you can find some peace out there that he never could. The drive to the ranch took Cole through country that looked like God's rough draft for the rest of Texas. Flat expanses of creosote bush and ocotillo stretched toward distant mountains that shimmered in the afternoon heat like mirages. The ranch house appeared after 40 minutes of driving on increasingly narrow roads, a 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch that sagged slightly on the east side. 240 acres of borderland, according to the property survey McKinney had included with the deed. Cole killed the engine and sat in the truck for a long moment, listening to the absolute silence that only exists in places where human beings are vastly outnumbered by the sky. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals with the patience of something that had all day to find its next meal. He found the first photograph in the mailbox at the end of the driveway, an old Polaroid, colors faded to sepia tones. Raymond and a young boy, Cole himself at maybe 8 years old, standing on the banks of the Rio Grande with fishing poles and identical grins. Cole remembered that day, remembered his grandfather's patient hands showing him how to tie a hook, the way the old man had laughed when Cole caught his first base. The house smelled like dust and loneliness and the ghost of coffee that had been brewing in the same pot for 70 years. Furniture covered in sheets like museum pieces. Raymond's bedroom untouched, bed made with military precision. Cole dropped his duffel bag on the living room floor and walked through rooms that felt like exhibits in a museum dedicated to a life he'd never really known. It was in the kitchen that he found the second photograph. This one tacked to the refrigerator with a magnet from some long-forgotten vacation. Raymond as a young man, maybe 19 or 20, standing next to another man in an expensive-looking suit. Both of them were smiling, but there was something in Raymond's eyes that Cole recognized from looking in mirrors after bad nights, the weight of secrets. Someone had written on the back in pencil, Raymond and Mr. Hartwell, 1953. Cole found the path on his second day at the ranch, barely visible through the mesquite and live oak that had grown wild over the years. Something pulled him down that overgrown trail, some instinct honed by too many patrols through hostile territory in places where the wrong step could end your life in ways you'd never imagined. The mesa appeared gradually, rising from the desert floor like the backbone of some ancient creature. Red sandstone weathered by a million years of wind and rain into fantastic shapes that could have been art installations if nature had any interest in human approval. And built into the side of the mesa, half buried in stone and shadow, was a concrete bunker that looked like it had been designed by someone with a very clear idea of what needed to be kept out, or what needed to be kept in. The door was steel, military grade, with a sign bolted to the metal that Cole could read from 20 feet away. Property of U.S. Department of Labor, authorized access only, 1953. Heavy chains wrapped around the door handles, secured with a padlock that looked like it could have stopped a tank. The kind of lock that said someone had wanted this place sealed, not just closed. Cole circled the structure, his training automatically cataloging details. No other entrances, no windows, no way in except through that chain door. The concrete was solid, built to last, built to contain. Whatever was inside had been deemed important enough to secure with government-level paranoia and expensive enough to justify the kind of construction that could have housed a family. He stood in front of the bunker as the sun dropped toward the horizon, painting the sky the color of old blood. What had Raymond been hiding out here for 70 years? And why had the government been involved? That evening, Cole sat on the porch and opened the envelope McKinney had given him. Inside were 3 brass keys, each one stamped with a different word: truth, forgiveness, and Pete. Beneath the keys was a cassette tape in a plastic case, the label written in Raymond's careful handwriting. For Cole, play only if you choose to open the door. He held the tape up to the dying light, wondering what kind of message his grandfather had left for him, and why it was tied to a bunker that looked like it belonged in a government facility rather than on a cattle ranch. There was no cassette player in the house that he could find. Raymond had gotten rid of anything that could play this message, making sure Cole would have to make a choice first. The next morning brought visitors. Cole was examining the padlock on the bunker when he heard the sound of engines, low and powerful, approaching from the direction of the main road. He turned to see 3 vehicles making their way up the dirt track toward the house. 2 black Chevy Suburbans and a Ford F-450 King Ranch edition that probably cost more than Cole made in 2 years. 6 men emerged from the Suburbans, all wearing the kind of casual clothes that cost serious money and the kind of alertness that suggested they'd been hired for more than their conversational skills. The man who climbed out of the F-450 looked like he'd stepped off the cover of a magazine called Wealthy Rancher Monthly. Silver hair perfectly styled despite the West Texas wind, boots that had never seen mud, and a smile that belonged in a boardroom where people made decisions about other people's lives. "You must be Cole Brennan," the man said, extending a hand as he walked over. His grip was firm, calculated to impress without crossing the line into aggression. "Connor Hartwell. My family's been neighbors to this ranch for 4 generations." Cole didn't take the offered hand immediately, studying the man's face. Good-looking in the way that money could buy, but with eyes that reminded Cole of politicians he'd met in Iraq. The kind of eyes that could look sincere while calculating the most efficient way to get what they wanted. "It's just Cole," he said finally, accepting the handshake. "And the name was Raymond, not Ray." Something flickered across Hartwell's features. Irritation, quickly masked by that practiced smile. "Of course. My apologies. The years have a way of blurring things together, don't they?" He gestured around the property with the casual air of someone surveying his own domain. "I was sorry to hear about your grandfather's passing. Fine man. Knew when to leave well enough alone." "What's that supposed to mean?" Hartwell's gaze drifted toward the mesa where the bunker sat like a concrete tumor in the red rock. "Some things are better left undisturbed, Cole. Your grandfather understood that. He lived peacefully here for decades by respecting certain boundaries." The smile never wavered, but Cole felt the threat underneath it like static electricity before a storm. "I'm offering you $3.2 million for this land. It's close in 15 days. That's generous for property this complicated." "What kind of complications?" "The kind that require lawyers, investigations, maybe federal attention that nobody really wants." Hartwell's eyes went cold despite the smile. "Or you could take the money and start fresh somewhere peaceful. Somewhere without all these messy historical issues." Cole felt his jaw tighten, the familiar weight settling in his chest that came before trouble. "I think you should leave my property now." The 6 men by the Suburbans straightened almost imperceptibly, hands moving closer to jacket fronts. Hartwell raised a hand, stopping them with the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We're neighbors, Cole. Been neighbors for 4 generations. I'd like to keep things friendly." He pulled a business card from his jacket and dropped it on the ground between them. "Offer stands for 15 days. After that, well, I can't promise the situation stays simple." The convoy left slowly, deliberately, raising a cloud of dust that hung in the air long after the sound of engines had faded. Cole watched them disappear over the horizon, then picked up the business card. Hartwell Land and Cattle Corporation, 40,000 acres. Below that, in smaller print, established 1953. That afternoon, Cole drove to Marfa looking for a cassette player. The town sat in the high desert like a movie set someone had forgotten to strike. Art galleries and coffee shops occupying buildings that had once housed more practical establishments. The thrift store on Highland Avenue had exactly what he needed: a Sony Walkman from the 1980s that looked like it had survived a nuclear war, but still functioned well enough to play a tape. He bought it for $15 and drove back to the ranch with the afternoon sun hammering down on the truck's roof like a blacksmith working hot metal. The silence of the desert was absolute, except for the wind through the mesquite and the distant cry of a hawk hunting in the thermals above the mesa. Cole sat on the porch as the shadows lengthened and inserted Raymond's tape into the player. The voice that came through the tiny speakers was his grandfather's, but younger than Cole had ever heard it, stronger and clearer than the old man who died 3 days ago. "Son, if you're hearing this, I'm dead, and you've decided to open Pandora's box." Static crackled through the speakers, but underneath it Cole could hear his grandfather taking a breath, steadying himself for whatever came next. "What I'm about to tell you will put you in danger. Real danger. But keeping quiet has been killing me slowly for 70 years, and I won't let it kill you too." The tape warped slightly, words cutting in and out like a radio signal struggling through atmospheric interference. "In 1953, I worked as foreman for Victor Hartwell's ranch. Good job, good pay, and I was young enough to think that good money meant good work. Mr. Hartwell had government contracts to house Mexican workers through the Bracero program. Legal workers, Cole. They had papers, families waiting for them back home, dreams about the money they'd make in America." Cole paused the tape and looked toward the mesa where the bunker sat like an accusing finger pointing at the sky. Mexican workers, government contracts, 1953. The pieces of something dark and complicated were starting to arrange themselves in his mind. He pressed play again. Raymond's voice continued, weaker now, as if the act of confession was physically draining him even across the decades. 63 men came to work the ranch that spring. Good workers, hard workers. They lived in the bunkhouse Mr. Hartwell had built for them, sent money home every week, talked about their families and their plans for when the contract ended. A long pause filled with static. Then they started asking for better conditions. The work was hard, the hours long, and Mr. Hartwell wasn't paying them what the government contract specified. They wanted to contact the Labor Department, file complaints. The tape continued, Raymond describing meetings with ranch owners, negotiations over labor contracts, payments processed through his company. Then his voice went sharp with concern. "Mr. Hartwell told me to move them to the bunker, said it was temporary, just until he could resolve the labor situation. I did what I was told, Cole. I was 19 years old, and he was paying me more money than I'd ever seen. I led 63 men into that bunker, and I locked the door behind them." Cole's hand tightened on the player, his thumb hovering over the stop button. Part of him didn't want to hear the rest, didn't want to know what his grandfather had been carrying all these years. But the larger part, the part that had carried him through 2 wars and a marriage that ended in failure, needed to hear it all. They were supposed to be in there for 1 night, maybe 2, just until Mr. Hartwell could work things out with the Labor Department. Raymond's voice cracked, the sound of a man confronting his worst moment across the span of 70 years. "But Mr. Hartwell never let them out. He told me they were being fed, told me they were comfortable, told me it was all temporary. I wanted to believe him because believing him was easier than admitting I'd helped lock up 63 human beings like animals." The wind picked up, rattling the porch screens and carrying the scent of creosote and distant rain. Cole looked toward the mesa and imagined 63 men locked in that concrete box, waiting for freedom that would never come. By the time I realized what was really happening, it was too late. Mr. Hartwell said if I opened that door, if I said anything to anyone, I'd be just as guilty as he was. Accessory to kidnapping, he called it. Conspiracy to violate federal labor laws. He had friends in the government, Cole. People who could make me disappear just as easily as those workers had disappeared. The tape went silent for so long that Cole thought it had ended. Then his grandfather's voice returned, barely above a whisper. I took $8,000 to keep quiet. $8,000 for 63 lives. I told myself I didn't know they would die in there. I told myself Mr. Hartwell would figure out a way to let them go. I told myself a lot of lies to make sleeping possible. A sound that might have been crying, muffled by decades and magnetic tape. The money's still in the bank, Cole, every penny of it, earning interest for 70 years. I never spent a dime. I couldn't. Cole stopped the tape and sat in the gathering darkness, watching the first stars appear over the desert. 63 men had died in that bunker, while his grandfather told himself comforting lies and counted blood money. The weight of that knowledge settled on him like a physical thing, pressing down on his chest until breathing became an act of will. His phone rang, jarring him back to the present. The number was local, Marfa area code. He answered without checking the caller ID. Cole Brennan? Yeah. This is Dr. Elena Ruiz. I'm a professor at UT Austin, and I specialize in the history of the Bracero program. I knew your grandfather. We corresponded for several years before his death. The woman's voice was careful, professional, but Cole could hear something underneath it. Hope mixed with the kind of desperation that comes from carrying unanswered questions for too long. I wonder if we could meet. There are things about that bunker that you need to know. Cole looked toward the mesa, where the bunker sat invisible in the darkness, but present in his mind like a tumor. What kind of things? The kind that explain why Connor Hartwell is willing to pay you $3.2 million to leave town and never come back. The line went quiet except for the sound of wind and distance. Finally, Cole spoke. When do you want to meet? Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, I'll come to you. A pause. Mr. Brennan, your grandfather spent 70 years trying to find the courage to do what he should have done in 1953. Maybe you're the one who can finish what he started. After she hung up, Cole sat on the porch until well past midnight, listening to the desert and thinking about choices made by young men who thought they understood the world. Raymond had been 19 when he'd locked 63 men in a concrete box. Cole had been 19 when he'd first fired his weapon in anger, when he'd learned that good intentions and bad outcomes could occupy the same space in a man's soul. The difference was that Cole's wars had ended. His grandfather's war had lasted 70 years, fought in the silence of his own conscience. And now that war had passed to Cole like an inheritance he'd never asked for, but couldn't refuse. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Jennifer's number. It was too late to call, but not too late to send a text that might reach her in the morning. Something's come up at the ranch. Might be here longer than planned. Kiss Lily for me. He sent the message and immediately regretted it. Jennifer would read between the lines, would hear the tone of a man making excuses for another failure. She wouldn't understand that this wasn't about running away from responsibility, but about finally running towards something that mattered. Cole walked to the edge of the porch and looked toward the mesa where his grandfather's secret waited in the darkness. 63 men had died in that bunker, their families never knowing what had happened to sons and fathers and brothers who had crossed the border with hope and disappeared into the Texas desert like smoke. Tomorrow he would meet Dr. Ruiz and learn more about the crime Raymond had helped commit. Tomorrow he would have to decide whether to take Hartwell's money and walk away or open that bunker and face whatever consequences came with the truth. But tonight he stood in the darkness and listened to the wind carry voices across 70 years of silence, promising the dead that their wait was almost over. Elena Ruiz arrived at 10 in the morning, driving a Honda CR-V that had seen better decades but still ran with the determination of something built to last. Cole watched from the porch as she parked next to his F-150, noting the careful way she surveyed the property before getting out. She was younger than her voice had suggested, maybe 45, with the kind of weathered attractiveness that came from spending time in places where the sun didn't apologize for being harsh. Two children emerged from the back seat, a boy of 16 with the sullen posture of someone who'd rather be anywhere else, and a girl of 10 with curious eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. The girl immediately started toward the mesa where the bunker sat, but her mother called her back with the sharp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mr. Brennan?" Dr. Ruiz extended her hand as she approached the porch. Her grip was firm, brief, professional. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. These are my children, Carlos and Sophia. I hope you don't mind them coming along. School's out for teacher conferences." Cole nodded, studying her face. There was something familiar about her features, something that nagged at the back of his mind like a half-remembered song. "You said you knew my grandfather." She pulled a manila envelope from her bag, the paper yellowed with age. "He wrote to me first in 2010, after he read an article I published about missing bracero workers in West Texas. Said he had information about my grandfather, Miguel Ruiz, who disappeared from the Hartwell Ranch in 1954. The name hit Cole like a physical blow. Miguel Ruiz, one of the 63 men Raymond had locked in that bunker. He looked at Dr. Ruiz with new understanding, seeing now why her features had seemed familiar. She had the same bone structure, the same determined set to her jaw that he'd noticed in some of the Mexican workers he'd served alongside in Iraq. Your grandfather was one of them. 18 years old, came to Texas to earn money for his family back in Michoacan. He was supposed to work 6 months and return home for his sister's wedding. Her voice carried the weight of 70 years of unanswered questions. Instead, he vanished like he'd never existed. No death certificate, no official record, no explanation. Just gone. She opened the envelope and pulled out a letter written in Raymond's careful handwriting. The paper was old but well preserved, as if it had been read many times over the years. Your grandfather sent me this in 2015, 3 years before his Alzheimer's got too bad for him to write coherently. He said he'd been carrying a secret for 60 years and couldn't take it to his grave. She handed Cole the letter. He said you were the only one who might have the courage to do what he couldn't. Cole unfolded the paper and read his grandfather's words written in blue ink that had faded to the color of old bruises. "Ah, Therese, your grandfather Miguel didn't run away like the official reports claimed. He died in a bunker on my property along with 62 other men, and I helped put him there. I was 19 years old and thought I knew the difference between right and wrong. I was wrong about both. The evidence is sealed in the bunker with them. I've spent 60 years trying to find the courage to open that door and face what I did. Maybe my grandson will be braver than I was. Maybe he'll give those men the justice I was too cowardly to provide." Cole folded the letter and handed it back, his hand steadier than he felt. Sophia had wandered close enough to hear parts of the conversation, and her eyes were wide with the kind of fascination children have for adult secrets they're not supposed to understand. "How long have you been researching this?" 11 years. Since my grandmother died and left me a box of letters Miguel had sent home before he disappeared. 47 letters in 6 months, then nothing. She kept them all, hoping he'd come back to explain. Dr. Ruiz's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd spent too many years chasing ghosts. "I've tracked down families of 18 other missing workers from the same time period. All of them got the same official explanation. The men had violated their work agreements and returned to Mexico without proper documentation." Carlos had wandered over to Cole's truck and was examining the Marine Corps sticker on the rear window with the casual interest of a teenager who'd grown up around military families. "You serve in Iraq?" 2 tours, 2003 and 2006. Cole found himself studying the boy's face, looking for traces of Miguel Ruiz in features that had been shaped by 7 decades of American life. "You look like someone I might have served with. A lot of good men with your grandfather's name." "Mom says I look like my great-grandfather, the one who died here." Carlos glanced toward the mesa, then back at Cole. "She's been obsessed with this story my whole life. Used to tell me bedtime stories about finding the truth instead of fairy tales about princes and dragons." Dr. Ruiz shot her son a look that carried the weight of years of family arguments about the cost of carrying other people's ghosts. "Carlos thinks I should let the past stay buried. He's probably right, but I can't. Not when I know they're still out there, still waiting for someone to remember their names." Cole walked to the edge of the porch and looked toward the bunker, thinking about the cassette tape and the 3 brass keys Raymond had left him. Truth, forgiveness, peace. The old man had arranged his confession like a test, forcing Cole to choose between comfortable ignorance and difficult knowledge. "What exactly do you want from me, Dr. Ruiz?" "I want to open that bunker. I want to see what your grandfather left inside. And I want to make sure those 63 men finally get the recognition they deserve." She joined him at the porch railing, her voice dropping to something close to a whisper. But mostly I want to know what happened to my grandfather in his final hours. Whether he was afraid, whether he suffered, whether he thought about the family he'd never see again. Sophia had found a stick and was drawing patterns in the dirt, creating elaborate designs that looked like the kind of art children make when they're processing things too big for words. Mama, why did they lock the men in the box? Because some people care more about money than they do about other people's lives, mija. That's stupid. Yes, it is. Cole pulled the 3 brass keys from his pocket, the metal warm from his body heat. Truth, forgiveness, peace. Raymond had known exactly what he was asking of his grandson, had understood the weight of the choice he was passing down like a curse disguised as an inheritance. There's something else you need to know, he said. Connor Hartwell came by yesterday, offered me $3.2 million to sell this place and disappear. Dr. Ruiz went very still, the kind of stillness that comes before violence or revelation. How much do you know about Connor Hartwell? Not much. Son of the man my grandfather worked for, owns a lot of land, apparently has a lot of influence. He owns 40,000 acres and has his fingers in every major business deal in 3 counties. He's also been systematically intimidating anyone who asks questions about the missing Bracero workers. She pulled out her phone and showed Cole a series of photographs. Burned out buildings, vandalized cars, newspaper clippings about mysterious accidents. Dr. Patricia Mendez at Sul Ross University was researching the same disappearance as I am. Her office burned down in 2018. Electrical fire, according to the fire marshal. Accidents happen. Dr. James Whitfield at UT El Paso was compiling oral histories from families of missing workers. He died in a single car accident on Highway 90 in 2019. Fell asleep at the wheel, they said. Cole studied the photographs, his military training automatically cataloging patterns and coincidences that looked too convenient to be random. How many researchers have had accidents? 5 that I can document. All of them were getting close to something Hartwell doesn't want found. She put the phone away and met his eyes. I should have been number 6. My brakes failed on I-35 last year. Fortunately, I was able to get the car stopped before I hit the bridge abutment. Why haven't you gone to the FBI? With what? Suspicions? Coincidences? They need evidence, and the evidence is in that bunker. She gestured toward the mesa. Your grandfather spent 70 years collecting that evidence. Financial records, correspondence, documentation of what really happened in 1954. According to his letters, it's all still there, sealed away with the men who died because of it. Carlos had finished examining Cole's truck and was now studying the ranch house with the kind of attention teenagers usually reserve for video games or social media. This place is creepy. It feels like it's been waiting for something to happen. Places remember, Sophia said without looking up from her dirt drawings. That's what Abuela used to say. Bad places remember bad things, and they make the air feel heavy until someone fixes what got broken. Cole found himself staring at the 10-year-old, struck by the casual wisdom of someone too young to understand how profound her observation was. The ranch did feel like it was waiting, had felt that way since the moment he'd arrived, as if the land itself was holding its breath. I need to know what I'm getting into, he said finally. If we open that bunker and find what you think is in there, Connor Hartwell is going to do whatever it takes to stop us. Are you prepared for that? Dr. Ruiz was quiet for a long moment, watching her children explore the property with the fearless curiosity of people who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of the right things. My grandfather was 18 years old when he came to this country. He had a wife waiting for him, a baby daughter he'd never seen, dreams about the life he was going to build with American wages. Connor Hartwell's father took all of that away from him, and Connor has spent his entire life protecting the secret of what his family did. She turned to face Cole directly, and he could see in her eyes the same determination that had carried him through 2 wars and a marriage that ended in failure. I've spent 11 years preparing for this moment. My children understand what's at stake, and they understand why it matters. The question is whether you're prepared to finish what your grandfather started. Cole looked at the 3 keys in his palm, then toward the bunker where 63 men had died, while Raymond Brennan told himself comfortable lies about temporary measures and extenuating circumstances. The weight of that knowledge settled on him like armor, heavy but necessary. There's more to the story. My grandfather left me a tape. He told her about Raymond's confession, about the $8,000 in the government contracts, and Victor Hartwell's casual transformation of legal workers into slaves. Dr. Ruiz listened without interruption, her face growing paler as the dimensions of the crime became clear. So it wasn't just murder, she said when he finished. It was theft. Victor Hartwell collected government money to house and feed those workers, then killed them and kept the payments for himself. 63 men at probably $200 a month each for 6 months. That's $75,000 in 1954 money. Cole did the math in his head, using the kind of quick calculation that had kept him alive in places where knowing the odds could mean the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. Maybe $750,000 in today's money. Not enough to build an empire, but enough to start one. The Hartwell Ranch was nearly bankrupt in 1952, Dr. Ruiz said. I found the records in the county courthouse. Victor Hartwell was facing foreclosure on everything he owned. Then suddenly in 1954, he started buying land again. Lots of land. Sophia had moved closer to them, her young mind clearly working through the implications of what she was hearing. So the bad man stole money from the dead people and used it to buy more land to be bad on. That's exactly what happened, mija. That's really stupid and mean. Cole found himself smiling despite the gravity of the conversation. Children had a way of cutting through complexity to reach the essential truth of things. Victor Hartwell had been stupid and mean, and those simple words carried more moral weight than any legal document or historical analysis. The bunker's locked with 3 different keys, he told Dr. Ruiz. My grandfather left them to me with labels. Truth, forgiveness, peace. I think he wanted to make sure whoever opened that door understood the weight of what they were doing. Then let's go understand it. They walked toward the mesa in single file, Cole leading, Dr. Ruiz behind him, the children following with the kind of excitement that comes from being included in adult business that usually excludes them. The path was rougher than it looked from a distance, carved into the rock face by flash floods and wind erosion over thousands of years. The bunker looked smaller in daylight, less threatening but somehow more permanent. A concrete monument to human cruelty built into stone that had existed long before humans learned to build monuments to anything. The steel door reflected the morning sun like a mirror, too bright to look at directly. Cole examined the locks more carefully than he had the day before, noting the way the chains had been arranged to require 3 separate keys turned in sequence. Raymond had wanted to make sure whoever opened this door had to make a deliberate choice, had to acknowledge that they were crossing a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. Truth first, he said, inserting the first key into its lock. The mechanism turned with the smooth precision of something built to last, probably military surplus from World War II. Then forgiveness. The second lock opened just as easily, as if it had been maintained and oiled regularly over the years. Carlos had pulled out his phone and was recording everything with the casual documentation instinct of his generation. This is like opening a tomb or something. Are we going to find mummies? Not mummies, Cole said, fitting the third key into its lock. Something worse. The final lock opened with a sound like a sigh. 70 years of pressure releasing all at once. Cole unwrapped the chains and let them fall to the ground with a metallic crash that echoed off the mesa walls. The steel door swung open on hinges that screamed in protest, revealing darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than simply blocking it. The smell hit them immediately. Not decay, which would have been expected after 70 years, but something else. The smell of fear and desperation and human suffering that had somehow survived in the airless space like a ghost made of molecules. Sophia stepped back and covered her nose with her shirt, but she didn't run. Cole pulled out his phone and activated the flashlight, the LED beam cutting through darkness that seemed almost solid. The bunker extended deeper into the mesa than he'd expected, a concrete corridor that disappeared into black nothing. But it was what lined the walls of that corridor that made Dr. Ruiz gasp and Carlos stop recording. 63 sets of work clothes hung on hooks along both walls, each one carefully arranged as if the workers had simply stepped out of them for a moment and would return to claim them soon. Beneath each set of clothes was a wooden box, handmade and carefully labeled with names written in Spanish and English. Personal effects, Dr. Ruiz whispered. Someone preserved their personal effects. Cole moved deeper into the bunker, his light illuminating more than he wanted to see. The corridor opened into a larger room where simple wooden bunks lined the walls, each one made up with military precision. At the foot of each bunk was a small shrine Photographs and letters and personal items arranged with the kind of care that suggested someone had known these men personally. My grandfather didn't just lock them in here, Cole said, understanding flooding through him like cold water. He maintained their memory. For 70 years, he's been taking care of this place like a cemetery. Dr. Ruiz had found a bunk marked Mita Ruiz and was kneeling beside it, her hands shaking as she picked up a photograph of a young man who looked exactly like Carlos would in a few years. The same eyes, the same stubborn set to the jaw, the same expression of someone who believed the world was fundamentally fair and just needed the right approach to prove it. Abuelo, she whispered, pressing the photograph to her chest. Sophia had ventured further into the bunker and was standing in front of a wall covered with what looked like a timeline, newspaper clippings, photographs, official documents, all arranged chronologically from 1953 to the present. At the top, in Raymond's careful handwriting, were the words, "So they are not forgotten." "Mr. Brennan," Sophia called out, her voice echoing strangely in the concrete space. "There's more rooms back here, and one of them has a really big lock." Cole followed her voice deeper into the bunker, through a second corridor that opened into what had obviously been Victor Hartwell's private office. A heavy wooden desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with ledgers and correspondence and what looked like 70 years' worth of documentation. But it was the vault door at the far end of the office that caught his attention. Steel bank grade, with a combination lock that looked like it had come from a military installation. Above the door, carved into the concrete, were the words, "Evidence Room." Dora Ruiz had followed them into the office, still clutching her grandfather's photograph. Raymond didn't just preserve their memory, he preserved the proof of what happened to them. Cole approached the vault door and found a manila envelope taped to its surface, his name written on it in Raymond's handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 numbers in a short message. The combination is Miguel's birthday, month and year he died, and the number of men who died with him. The truth is in there, Cole, all of it. Do with it what I couldn't. "When was your grandfather born?" Cole asked Dr. Ruiz. "March 15th, 936. Cole turned the combination dial with steady hands. 3:15:54:63. The vault door opened with a solid chunk of precision machinery, revealing a room that looked like it belonged in the FBI headquarters rather than a bunker in the West Texas desert. Filing cabinets lined the walls, each one labeled with categories that told the story of a systematic crime: financial records, government correspondence, worker contracts, death certificates, property transfers. In the center of the room was a desk with an old reel-to-reel tape recorder, several boxes of tapes, and a note in Raymond's handwriting. "Play tape number 1 first, then decide if you want to hear the rest." Carlos had been quiet since they'd entered the bunker, but now he spoke up with the kind of insight that sometimes comes from seeing things without the burden of adult assumptions. He wasn't just feeling guilty about what he did. He was building a case, like a detective or something. Dr. Ruiz was examining the filing cabinets with the focused attention of someone who'd spent years looking for exactly this kind of evidence. "This is everything. Financial records showing the government payments Victor Hartwell received for housing the workers. Correspondence with Labor Department officials. Forged documentation showing the workers had voluntarily returned to Mexico." Cole had found a box labeled audio evidence and was looking at a list of contents that made his stomach turn. Tape number 1, Victor Hartwell's instructions to foreman, June 1954. Tape number 2, recorded conversations with government officials. Tape number 3, final radio transmissions from bunker, June 1820, 1954. "The final transmissions," Dr. Ruiz said, her voice barely audible. "They had radio contact while they were locked in here." Cole looked at the old tape recorder, its reels empty and waiting. 70 years of secrets waited in those boxes, testimony from the dead and the living that could destroy the Hartwell family and finally give 63 murdered men the justice they deserved. But justice came with a price, and that price was measured in the courage required to listen to the voices of men who had died calling for help that never came. Sophia had been exploring the evidence room with the fearless curiosity of childhood, and now she stood in front of a wall covered with photographs. These are all the same people from the beds, but they're alive in these pictures. They look happy, The photographs were arranged like a memorial, each one showing a young man in work clothes, smiling at the camera with the kind of hope that comes from believing hard work will be rewarded with prosperity. Beneath each photograph was a name, a birth date, and the name of a town in Mexico where someone was still waiting for a letter that would never come. Yes. Dr. Ruiz had found her grandfather's file and was reading through documents that chronicled his short life with bureaucratic precision. Birth certificate, work visa, employment contract with Hartwell Ranch, weekly wage statements that stopped abruptly on June 15th, 1954. At the bottom of the file was a letter in Spanish, handwritten on thin paper, that she read aloud with a voice that carried 70 years of grief. My dearest Miguel, your daughter took her first steps yesterday, and I wish you could have seen her face when she realized she could walk to wherever she wanted to go. She has your stubborn spirit and your beautiful eyes. We are all proud of the work you are doing in America, and we count the days until you return home to us. Your loving wife, Carmen. The letter was dated June 20th, 1954, 5 days after Miguel Ruiz had been locked in a concrete bunker to die with 62 other men whose only crime was expecting to be treated like human beings. Cole loaded the first tape onto the reel-to-reel player, his hands steadier than his heart. The machine hummed to life with the sound of old technology that had been maintained with obsessive care. And after a moment of static, Victor Hartwell's voice filled the evidence room with the casual authority of a man who had never doubted his right to decide who lived and who died. Raymond, we have a situation with the Mexican workers. They're talking about contacting the Labor Department, filing complaints about working conditions and wage irregularities. This kind of attention could shut down our entire operation and cost us the government contracts. A pause filled with the sound of papers rustling. I need you to move them to the auxiliary bunker tonight. Tell them it's temporary, just until we can address their concerns through proper channels. Make sure they understand this is for their own protection. Raymond's voice, young and uncertain. How long will they be in there, Mr. Hartwell? As long as it takes to resolve the situation permanently. They signed contracts, Raymond, legal documents that give us considerable latitude in how we manage their employment. If they want to complain about American working conditions, they can do it from Mexico. The tape continued for another 20 minutes. Victor Hartwell's voice outlining a plan that transformed legal workers into prisoners and prisoners into corpses with the kind of methodical planning usually reserved for legitimate business operations. By the time the tape ended, Cole understood that what had happened in 1954 wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of poor judgment. It was a calculated act of mass murder disguised as labor management. Dr. Ruiz was crying quietly, her tears falling on her grandfather's photograph. Carlos had stopped recording and was staring at the tape player with the kind of expression children get when they first understand that the world contains genuine evil. Sophia was studying the photographs on the wall with the intensity of someone trying to memorize faces she would never see again except in dreams. There are 17 more tapes, Cole said, looking at the boxes of evidence Raymond had accumulated over 7 decades. Financial records showing how Victor Hartwell used the money he stole to buy land and influence. Correspondence with government officials who helped him cover up the murders. Documentation of how the Hartwell empire was built on the graves of 63 innocent men. The sound of vehicles approaching broke through the silence of the bunker like gunshots. Cole moved to the entrance and saw 3 black SUVs making their way up the dirt road toward the ranch house. Dust clouds marking their progress across the desert like smoke signals. Connor Hartwell, he said, understanding immediately that their time had run out. Somehow Hartwell had known they were here, had been watching and waiting for them to open the bunker so he could close it permanently. Dr. Ruiz was gathering documents and photographs with the desperate efficiency of someone who knew she might not get another chance. We have to get this evidence out of here. If Hartwell destroys it, those men will stay buried forever. Cole was already moving, his military training taking over, as adrenaline sharpened his focus to a point that could cut through panic and confusion. Carlos, Sophia, get to your mother's car and drive to town. Don't stop for anything. Don't talk to anyone except the sheriff. Tell him what we found here. We're not leaving you, Carlos said with the stubborn loyalty of someone who'd inherited his great-grandfather's refusal to abandon people who needed help. Yes, you are. This isn't your fight. They killed my great-grandfather. the boy said, his voice carrying a sudden hardness that made him sound much older than 16. That makes it my fight. The SUVs had reached the ranch house, and men were getting out, moving with the kind of practiced coordination that suggested they'd done this before. Cole counted 8 figures, all carrying what looked like serious hardware. "Everyone grab what you can," he said, stuffing financial records and tapes into a canvas bag. "We're leaving now." They ran through the bunker like refugees fleeing a war zone, gathering evidence and personal effects in 70 years of carefully preserved truth. Dr. Ruiz clutched her grandfather's photograph and letters, while Sophia carried a small wooden cross that had been beside one of the bunks. Carlos had his phone out again, recording everything with the desperate hope that video evidence might survive, even if they didn't. Cole was the last one out of the bunker, pausing at the threshold to look back at the memorial Raymond had maintained for 7 decades. The empty bunks and carefully arranged shrines looked like a museum dedicated to forgotten lives, a testament to one man's attempt to balance the scales of a cosmic injustice. He sealed the bunker door and wrapped the chains around it, knowing that Connor Hartwell would be through them in minutes, but hoping the delay might give them enough time to reach safety. As they ran toward Dr. Ruiz's Honda, Cole could hear the sound of engines getting closer, the mechanical howl of men who had come to bury truth as efficiently as their predecessors had buried bodies. The question now wasn't whether they would escape with the evidence. The question was whether the evidence would matter to anyone who had the power to act on it, and whether Connor Hartwell would be content to simply destroy the proof of his father's crimes, or whether he would decide that the only way to keep the past buried was to bury the people who had disturbed it. Behind them, the bunker sat in the desert sun like an accusation carved in stone, waiting to reveal its secrets to whoever had the courage to listen to the voices of the dead. Cole's F-150 lurched across the desert floor like a wounded animal, its suspension screaming as he pushed the truck far beyond anything Ford's engineers had ever intended. Dr. Ruiz sat in the passenger seat, clutching a canvas bag filled with 70 years of evidence, while her children held on to whatever they could grab as the truck bounced and slammed through arroyos and around boulder fields that had stood unchanged since the Pleistocene. Behind them, the 3 black SUVs gained ground with the relentless determination of predators that had found fresh scent. Cole could see them in the rearview mirror, their dust trails converging into a single brown cloud that marked their progress across the high desert like smoke from a signal fire. These weren't ranch hands or private security guards. They moved with the kind of coordination that came from military training and the kind of equipment that cost serious money. "There's a county road about 3 miles south," Ruiz said, consulting a paper map with shaking hands. "If we can reach it, we might have a chance of finding help." "We won't make it 3 miles in this old truck," Cole replied, downshifting as they hit a particularly rough patch of caliche and limestone. The F-150 was built for ranch work, not for high-speed escapes across terrain that would challenge a military vehicle. "They're faster and they know this country better than we do." Sophia had been quiet since they'd fled the bunker, but now she spoke up with the kind of clarity that sometimes comes from seeing things without the burden of adult complications. "They're not trying to catch us. They're hurting us somewhere." Cole looked in the mirror again and realized the 10-year-old was right. The SUVs had the speed and numbers to run them down, but instead they were maintaining a steady distance, pushing the truck towards something that waited ahead. He grabbed his phone and tried calling Sheriff Torres, but the screen showed no signal. They were in the kind of country where cell towers were separated by 50 miles of nothing and satellite coverage was sporadic at best. "Arroyo Grande," Dr. Ruiz said, pointing to a spot on the map where several dry creek beds converged into a single canyon. "If they're pushing us toward it, there must be someone waiting there." The canyon appeared ahead of them like a wound in the earth, red sandstone walls rising on both sides of a floor that had been carved smooth by 10,000 years of flash floods. There was only one way in and one way out, which meant that whatever Connor Hartwell had planned was about to happen in a place where witnesses would be unlikely and escape would be impossible. Cole stopped the truck at the mouth of the canyon and turned to face the family he'd dragged into something that might get them all killed. Carlos was holding his phone, still recording everything with the desperate hope that video evidence might survive even if they didn't. Sophia clutched a small wooden cross she'd taken from the bunker, her young face set with the kind of determination that had carried her ancestors across an ocean and a continent in search of better lives. I'm going to get out here, Cole said. You take the truck and drive straight through the canyon. Don't stop for anything. Don't look back. Just keep driving until you find help. We're not leaving you, Elena said with the quiet authority of someone who'd made an irrevocable decision. This is my fight as much as yours. My grandfather died in that bunker. My children deserve to know that justice is possible, even if it takes 70 years to find it. Before Cole could argue, the sound of engines filled the canyon like thunder bouncing off stone walls. The three SUVs had arranged themselves in a semicircle at the canyon mouth, their occupants emerging with the kind of weapons that suggested this confrontation had been planned for maximum efficiency rather than minimum casualties. Connor Hartwell stepped out of the lead vehicle wearing the same expensive clothes and practiced smile he'd displayed at the ranch, but now both looked slightly frayed around the edges, as if the mask of civilized behavior was beginning to slip under pressure. 8 men flanked him, all carrying automatic weapons with the casual competence of people who'd used them professionally. "Mr. Brennan," Hartwell called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "I'm disappointed. I offered you a generous settlement for your property and a peaceful resolution to this unfortunate situation. Instead, you've chosen to involve innocent people in matters that don't concern them." Cole got out of the truck slowly, keeping his hands visible, but ready to move if the situation deteriorated further. His Colt 1911 was tucked into the small of his back, 7 rounds plus 1 in the chamber, but 8 against 1 made for poor odds even under the best circumstances. 63 murdered men concern everyone with a conscience, he replied. Your father was a monster, and you've spent your entire life protecting his legacy. My father was a businessman who made difficult decisions during difficult times. Hartwell's smile never wavered, but his eyes had gone cold in the way that suggested he'd moved past negotiation and into the realm of permanent solutions. The Bracero program was poorly managed from the beginning. Workers were often exploited, sometimes abandoned, occasionally disappeared. My father provided structure and purpose to men who might otherwise have died nameless in the desert. Ruiz had gotten out of the truck and was standing beside Cole with her grandfather's photograph pressed against her chest like armor. Your father locked 63 men in a concrete bunker and left them to die. He stole their wages, forged their death certificates, and used their blood money to build an empire. That's not business. That's mass murder. Dr. Ruiz, Hartwell said, and now his voice carried a note of something that might have been genuine regret mixed with calculated manipulation. I'm truly sorry about what happened to your family, but reopening old wounds serves no purpose except to cause more pain. Your grandfather and his fellow workers were victims of a system that was fundamentally flawed. My family has spent decades working to improve conditions for agricultural workers throughout Texas by threatening researchers and burning down archives and arranging accidents for anyone who asks inconvenient questions. Elena's voice cut through the canyon air like a blade. I know what you've been doing, Connor. 5 people have died because they got too close to the truth about 1954. Something shifted in Hartwell's expression, a subtle hardening that suggested they'd moved beyond the realm of polite conversation and into territory where words were just a prelude to action. Sometimes history is better left undisturbed. Sometimes the greater good requires difficult choices. Carlos had been recording the entire conversation, but now he lowered his phone and stepped forward with the kind of fearless stupidity that seems to be a genetic requirement for 16-year-old boys. You killed my great-grandfather. You killed all of them. And now you want to kill us to keep it secret. I didn't kill anyone, Hartwell replied with the patient tone of someone explaining basic facts to a slow child. I inherited a situation that was already resolved. My father made choices that I might not have made, but I can't change the past. I can only protect the future. Whose future? Sophia asked, and her 10-year-old voice carried across the canyon with the kind of moral clarity that made the armed men shift uncomfortably. Not the future of the families who never found out what happened to their fathers and sons and brothers. Not the future of people who deserve to know the truth. Cole could see the calculation in Hartwell. The cold assessment of a man weighing the cost of letting witnesses live against the risk of letting them tell their story. The armed men had spread out in a semicircle that covered every possible avenue of escape, and their weapons were no longer pointed at the ground. Connor, Cole said, using the man's first name with deliberate familiarity, you're standing at a crossroads. You can end this here today and spend the rest of your life knowing that you're no better than your father. Or you can let us walk away and finally give those 63 men the justice they deserve. Justice is a luxury for people who can afford it, Hartwell replied. Those workers were illegal aliens who violated their work agreements and attempted to extort money from my father through threats and work stoppages. They were criminals, Mr. Brennan. My father simply dealt with them the way criminals have always been dealt with in this part of Texas. They were human beings with families and dreams and the same right to life that you claim for yourself, Elena said, her voice rising with 70 years of accumulated anger. Your father murdered them for money, and you've been protecting that secret ever since. How many more people have to die before you admit what everyone in this canyon already knows? The standoff stretched across several heartbeats, armed men and unarmed civilians facing each other in a place where the bones of ancient peoples lay buried beneath layers of sandstone and time. Cole could feel the weight of the moment, the sense that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just whether they lived or died, but whether truth would survive another generation of comfortable lies. The sound that broke the tension came from an unexpected source, the satellite GPS unit Elena had been using to document the ranch. The device began broadcasting an emergency signal she had activated before they entered the bunker, sending their coordinates to emergency services and the FBI contact agent Stone had provided weeks earlier. Emergency services have been notified of our location, Elena said calmly, showing Hartwell the GPS unit. Agent Marcus Stone received our coordinates 20 minutes ago. Federal agents are already en route. The color drained from Hartwell's face as the implications of federal intervention rewrote the tactical situation. Whatever plan had brought them to this canyon, it had depended on isolation and the assumption that missing people in West Texas could disappear without generating the kind of attention that brought federal agencies into the picture. You're lying, Hartwell said, but his voice lacked conviction. The sound of helicopter rotors appeared first as a distant whisper, then grew steadily louder until it filled the canyon like mechanical thunder. Cole looked up to see a Texas Department of Public Safety aircraft circling overhead, its pilot maintaining a careful distance while undoubtedly relaying their position to ground units that were already en route. Hartwell's men looked to him for guidance, but their boss seemed to have retreated into some internal calculation that required more processing power than the situation allowed. The helicopter was joined by a second aircraft, this one bearing the distinctive markings of the U.S. Border Patrol, and the sound of their rotors created a wall of noise that made conversation impossible. When the engines finally throttled back enough to allow speech, it was Elena who spoke first, her voice carrying the weight of 11 years spent searching for answers that had finally been found. It's over, Connor. The truth is going to come out whether you kill us or not. The evidence is already in the hands of people who know how to use it. Your father's crimes are going to be exposed, and your family's empire is going to fall. My family built something that matters, Hartwell replied, but his words sounded hollow even to himself. We created jobs, supported communities, contributed to the economic development of West Texas for 3 generations. Built on graves, Carlos said, his young voice cutting through the noise of approaching vehicles with the kind of moral clarity that couldn't be purchased or negotiated away. Everything your family owns was paid for with the blood of murdered workers. The first ground vehicle appeared at the mouth of the canyon, a Texas Ranger Crown Victoria followed by 2 Border Patrol Chevy Tahoes and what looked like an FBI tactical unit in unmarked black SUVs. Connor Hartwell's private army found themselves outnumbered and outgunned by people who had legal authority to use the weapons they carried. Cole could see the moment when Hartwell's carefully constructed world began to collapse. The man who'd controlled 3 counties through money and influence, and the casual application of violence was suddenly just another suspect in a federal investigation, surrounded by people who couldn't be bought or intimidated or made to disappear. Connor Hartwell, called a voice amplified by a bullhorn. This is Agent Marcus Stone with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You and your associates are ordered to lay down your weapons and submit to federal custody. Any attempt to resist will result in the use of lethal force. The 8 armed men looked at each other with the kind of desperate calculation that comes when professional loyalty collides with personal survival instincts. These weren't ideological warriors or family retainers willing to die for a cause. They were hired guns who'd signed up to intimidate researchers and threaten witnesses, not to fight a gun battle with federal agents in a box canyon. One by one, they began laying their weapons on the ground and raising their hands. Connor Hartwell watched his private army surrender with the expression of a man discovering That money couldn't purchase the kind of loyalty, though, that survived contact with overwhelming force. "This isn't finished," he said to Cole, as FBI agents emerged from their vehicles with the purposeful efficiency of people who'd done this many times before. "My family has been part of this community for 70 years. We have connections, influence, resources that you can't imagine. Even if they arrest me, even if they find evidence, the Hartwell name will survive this." Agent Stone approached their group with the measured pace of someone who'd spent years learning to read dangerous situations. He was older than Cole had expected, probably in his mid-50s, with the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen enough human behavior to have developed a healthy skepticism about people's capacity for both good and evil. "Mr. Brennan," Stone said, extending his hand. "Agent Marcus Stone, I understand you've uncovered some historical evidence that might be relevant to several ongoing federal investigations." "Evidence of 63 murders," Cole replied, shaking the offered hand, "along with documentation showing how the Hartwell family built their empire using money stolen from the Mexican government and the families of the men they killed." Stone's expression didn't change, but Cole could see the satisfaction in his eyes of someone who'd been working a case for years and had finally found the breakthrough that would allow him to close it. "De Ruiz, I presume. I've read your research on missing Bracero workers. Excellent work. I'm sorry it took us so long to connect the dots." Elena was still clutching her grandfather's photograph, but now she held it out toward the FBI agent like an offering. "This is Miguel Ruiz. He was 18 years old when Victor Hartwell murdered him. He had a wife, a daughter he'd never seen, dreams about the future he was building with the American wages. He deserves justice, Agent Stone. They all do." "Yes, ma'am, they do," Stone replied, and his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that comes from decades of speaking for the dead. "And they're going to get it." Connor Hartwell was led away in handcuffs, but not before he turned back to face Cole one final time. The mask of civilized behavior had finally slipped completely, revealing something cold and calculating that had probably been hiding behind expensive clothes and charitable donations for most of his adult life. "This won't bring them back," he said. 63 dead Mexicans who have been dust for 70 years. Is destroying my family really worth it?" "Your family destroyed itself," Cole replied. "We just made sure the truth finally saw daylight." As the federal convoy prepared to leave the canyon, Agent Stone approached Cole and Elena with the kind of measured professionalism that suggested he understood the weight of what they'd accomplished. "The evidence you recovered from that bunker is going to take months to process, but what I've seen so far is comprehensive enough to support multiple federal indictments. Financial fraud, violation of civil rights, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice. Connor Hartwell is looking at life in prison, and we're going to seize every asset that can be traced back to the original crimes." Carlos was still recording, but now his phone was capturing something historic rather than desperate. The moment when 70 years of buried truth finally found its way to people with the authority to act on it. "What happens to the bunker?" Sophia asked, her child's mind cutting straight to the practical question that adults often overlooked. "The place where they died? It becomes a federal crime scene until our investigation is complete," Stone replied. "After that, it's up to the families of the victims to decide how they want their loved ones to be remembered." Elena looked toward the mesa where the bunker sat like a concrete monument to her grandfather's suffering, then back at the FBI agent who represented the possibility of justice delayed but not denied. "I want it to become a memorial," she said, "not just to the 63 men who died there, but to all the workers who came to this country looking for better lives and found exploitation instead of opportunity. Let it be a place where people can come to remember that every life has value, regardless of where someone was born, or what language they spoke, or how much money they had in their pockets." Agent Stone nodded with the kind of respect that suggested he'd seen enough senseless death to understand the importance of meaningful memorials. "I think that can be arranged, Ruiz. The federal government has programs for preserving sites of historical significance, especially when they relate to civil rights violations." As they prepared to leave the canyon, Cole found himself thinking about Raymond Brennan, the 19-year-old who'd made a choice that haunted him for 70 years, and the 91-year-old who'd spent his final years building a case that would finally allow the dead to speak for themselves. Justice had been delayed by 7 decades, but it had not been denied. The truth was finally free, and with it came the possibility that 63 murdered men might finally rest in peace, knowing that their lives had been remembered, their deaths had been acknowledged, and their families had been given the answers they'd been seeking for 3 generations. Behind them, the bunker waited in the desert sun, no longer a tomb for forgotten men, but a testament to the possibility that truth, however deeply buried, would eventually find its way to the surface. And in that possibility lay the hope that history's victims might someday find justice, even if it came too late for the living, but just in time for the dead. The canyon fell silent except for the whisper of wind through stone that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of civilizations, and now the end of a family dynasty built on blood and sustained by silence. In that silence, perhaps, 63 voices could finally rest. 6 months after Connor Hartwell's arrest in Arroyo Grande, Cole Brennan stood in a federal courtroom in San Antonio, watching justice move with the glacial patience of a system designed to be thorough rather than swift. The man who had controlled 3 counties through money and intimidation now sat at the defendant's table wearing an orange jumpsuit and the hollow expression of someone who had discovered that wealth could not purchase immunity from the consequences of 70 years of accumulated crimes. The evidence that Raymond Brennan had spent decades collecting filled 17 bankers' boxes arranged along the prosecution table like monuments to obsessive documentation. Financial records, audio recordings, correspondence, photographs, and personal effects from 63 murdered men painted a picture of systematic evil that had been disguised as legitimate business for 3 generations. Agent Marcus Stone had become something like a friend over the months of investigation, stopping by the ranch regularly to coordinate with Cole and Dr. Ruiz as they worked to identify every victim and locate surviving family members scattered across Mexico and the American Southwest. The FBI agent carried himself with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally been able to close a case that had haunted him for the better part of a decade. The grand jury returned indictments on 43 separate counts, Stone told Cole as they waited for the day's proceedings to begin. Murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit murder, violation of federal civil rights statutes, fraud, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and about 36 other charges that collectively carry a maximum sentence of life plus 400 years. Cole watched Connor Hartwell whisper instructions to his legal team, expensive lawyers who had spent the past 6 months trying to construct a defense for crimes that had been documented with the kind of obsessive detail that made denial impossible. The audio recordings alone provided testimony from the grave that no amount of legal maneuvering could effectively challenge. What about the asset forfeiture? That's where it gets interesting, Stone said, pulling out a folder thick with financial documents. The Hartwell Ranch Corporation is worth approximately $780 million in land, mineral rights, and business holdings. Under federal asset forfeiture laws, anything that can be traced back to the proceeds of criminal activity is subject to seizure. Elena Ruiz had taken a leave of absence from her teaching position at UT Austin to attend every day of the trial, sitting in the gallery with a notebook where she recorded the names of victims and the details of their deaths with the careful precision of someone who understood that remembering was itself a form of justice. Her children had returned to school in Austin, but they called every evening to hear about the day's testimony and to ask when they could visit the memorial that was being planned for the bunker site. The prosecution is calling Dr. Elena Ruiz, announced the court clerk, and Cole watched the woman who had become his partner in this long pursuit of truth walk to the witness stand with her grandfather's photograph clutched in her hand like a talisman. The prosecuting attorney was a career federal prosecutor named Sarah Chen, who had made a specialty of civil rights cases involving historical injustices. She approached the witness stand with the measured pace of someone who understood that justice delayed was not automatically justice denied, especially when the delay had been caused by systematic efforts to prevent the truth from emerging. Dr. Ruiz, can you tell the court about your relationship to this case? Elena's voice was steady as she began to speak. 11 years of research and investigation distilled into testimony that would help determine whether Connor Hartwell spent the rest of his life in federal prison. My grandfather, Miguel Ruiz, was 18 years old when he came to the United States under the Bracero program in 1954. He was hired to work at the Hartwell Ranch with the understanding that he would be provided housing, meals, and fair wages for agricultural labor. What happened to your grandfather? He was murdered by Victor Hartwell, along with 62 other Mexican workers who had asked for better working conditions and fair payment according to their contracts. Elena held up the photograph so the jury could see Miguel's young face. He was locked in a concrete bunker and left to die along with men who had come to America, hoping to build better lives for their families. Connor Hartwell's lead attorney objected on the grounds that the witness was offering conclusions rather than facts, but Judge Martinez overruled him with the weary patience of someone who had been listening to similar objections for 3 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming, the audio recordings were unambiguous, and the defense strategy had devolved into procedural challenges rather than substantive arguments about innocence or guilt. Dr. Ruiz, what impact did your grandfather's disappearance have on your family? Elena was quiet for a moment, composing herself before answering a question that reached back across 70 years of inherited grief. My grandmother Carmen waited for him to return until the day she died in 2010. She never remarried, never stopped believing that someday he would walk through the door with an explanation for why he had stopped writing. My mother grew up without a father, raised by a woman who was slowly dying of hope deferred. And what did you discover when you began researching your grandfather's disappearance? I discovered that the Hartwell family had been systematically murdering Bracero workers and covering up their crimes with the assistance of corrupt government officials and local law enforcement. I discovered that Connor Hartwell knew exactly what his father had done and had spent his entire adult life protecting those secrets through intimidation, violence, and murder. The defense attorney's objection was sustained this time, but the damage was already done. Elena Ruiz had spoken for 3 generations of women who had lived with unanswered questions, and her words carried the weight of accumulated truth that could not be cross-examined away. Agent Stone took the stand after lunch, bringing with him the methodical authority of someone who had spent months analyzing evidence and building connections that painted a comprehensive picture of criminal enterprise. His testimony filled the afternoon with details that transformed abstract concepts like fraud and conspiracy into specific acts with names and dates and dollar amounts. The financial records recovered from the bunker show systematic theft of wages owed to Mexican workers under the Bracero program, Stone explained, referring to charts and graphs that reduced human suffering to statistical analysis. Victor Hartwell was receiving approximately $1,200 per month from the federal government to house and feed 63 workers. After murdering them in June of 1954, he continued to collect those payments for an additional 18 months, claiming the workers were still employed but had been transferred to remote work sites. What was the total amount of money stolen? Approximately $25,000 in 1954 currency, which would be equivalent to roughly $250,000 today. But that was just the beginning of the financial benefit Victor Hartwell derived from these murders. Stone pulled out additional documents that showed how the stolen money had been leveraged into land purchases, mineral rights acquisitions, and business investments that formed the foundation of what eventually became a vast agricultural empire. The mathematics of murder revealed themselves in ledger entries and property transfers that traced an unbroken line from 63 deaths to $780 million in accumulated wealth. The Hartwell Ranch Corporation currently owns 40,000 acres of prime agricultural land, holds mineral rights on an additional 60,000 acres, and operates subsidiary businesses that employ over 400 people across West Texas. All of this wealth can be traced back to the money Victor Hartwell stole after murdering the Mexican workers in 1954. Connor Hartwell's defense team had hired expert witnesses to challenge the mathematical connections between historical crimes and contemporary wealth, but their arguments crumbled under the weight of documentation that Raymond Brennan had spent 70 years collecting. Every property purchase, every business investment, every expansion of the Hartwell empire was traced back through corporate records and bank statements to the original $25,000 in stolen blood money. Cole found himself thinking about his grandfather during the more technical portions of the testimony, imagining the young man who had helped commit these crimes and the old man who had spent the rest of his life building evidence that would finally expose them. Raymond had died before he could see justice done, but his obsessive documentation was speaking from the grave with the clarity of someone who had understood exactly what was at stake. The audio recordings were played on the 4th day of testimony, Victor Hartwell's voice filling the courtroom with the casual authority of a man who had never doubted his right to decide who lived and who died. The jury listened with the kind of horrified fascination that comes from witnessing evil that is both monstrous and banal, systematic murder planned and executed with the same attention to detail that might have been applied to any other business transaction. Cole watched Connor Hartwell's face as his father's voice described the logistics of mass murder with bureaucratic precision. The defendant showed no emotion beyond a slight tightening around his eyes, as if he were listening to testimony about crimes committed by strangers rather than learning the specific details of how his family's fortune had been acquired. Dr. Ruiz had been right about Connor's knowledge and complicity in covering up the original crimes. Financial records showed that he had inherited full knowledge of his father's methods along with the wealth they had generated, and that he had spent decades using intimidation and violence to prevent that knowledge from becoming public. The prosecution's star witness was a former Hartwell Ranch foreman named Jesus Morales, who had worked for the family for 38 years before his conscience finally overrode his fear. Morales testified about finding human remains while digging a new well in 1987, and about Connor Hartwell's instructions to rebury them quietly without reporting the discovery to authorities. Mr. Hartwell told me those bones were from old Indian graves, and that disturbing them would bring federal archaeologists and shut down ranch operations, Morales said in accented English that carried the weight of someone speaking truth that could have cost him his life. But I knew the bones were not that old, and I knew they belonged to men who had worked the ranch during my father's time. Why didn't you report this to authorities? Because Mr. Hartwell made it clear that anyone who talked about what they found would have problems. Big problems. And because I had a family to feed, and the Hartwell Ranch was the only good job in 3 counties. The testimony revealed a pattern of intimidation and violence that extended far beyond the original murders, encompassing decades of threats, accidents, and disappearances that had maintained the wall of silence around the family's secrets. Connor Hartwell had inherited more than wealth from his father. He had inherited a systematic approach to managing truth that treated human lives as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of protecting what had been stolen. On the 7th day of testimony, Cole was called to the witness stand to describe his discovery of the bunker and the evidence his grandfather had preserved there. Speaking in the formal language required by legal proceedings, he told the story of how a broken-down Marine had opened a door that had been sealed for 70 years and found inside it the carefully documented testimony of the dead. Mr. Brennan, what motivated you to open the bunker against the explicit warnings of Connor Hartwell? My grandfather spent 70 years carrying guilt about something he did when he was 19 years old. He left me the evidence I would need to make things right, and he trusted me to have the courage he hadn't been able to find. Cole looked directly at Connor Hartwell as he continued. 63 men died because people like Victor Hartwell believed that money gave them the right to treat other human beings like disposable property. My grandfather helped them do it, and he spent the rest of his life trying to figure out how to balance the scales. The defense attorney's cross-examination focused on Cole's military service and his struggles with PTSD, attempting to paint his actions as those of an unstable veteran seeking meaning in conspiracy theories and historical grievances. But the tactic backfired when Cole responded with the kind of calm authority that comes from having survived actual combat and learned to distinguish between real threats and imaginary ones. Mr. Brennan, isn't it true that you've been treated for alcoholism and anger management issues? Yes. And isn't it true that your marriage ended because of your inability to control violent outbursts related to your military service? My marriage ended because I came back from Iraq with trauma that I didn't know how to process. And I made the mistake of thinking that alcohol could help me forget things that needed to be remembered. But I never raised a hand to my wife or my daughter, and I never confused my personal problems with my ability to recognize evidence of mass murder when I found it. The prosecution's closing argument was delivered by Sarah Chen with the kind of methodical precision that transformed 70 years of accumulated evidence into a narrative that connected past crimes with present consequences. She spoke for 3 hours, weaving together financial records and audio recordings and personal testimony into a comprehensive indictment of systematic evil that had been disguised as legitimate business enterprise. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, over the course of this trial, you have heard evidence of crimes that span 3 generations and encompass every form of evil that human beings are capable of inflicting on one another. Murder, theft, fraud, intimidation, and conspiracy to obstruct justice, all committed in service of protecting wealth that was stolen from the graves of 63 innocent men. She paused to let her words settle into the silence of the courtroom before continuing with the kind of moral authority that comes from speaking for people who can no longer speak for themselves. Connor Hartwell wants you to believe that he is not responsible for crimes his father committed before he was born. But the evidence shows that Connor inherited full knowledge of those crimes along with the wealth they generated, and that he spent his entire adult life using violence and intimidation to prevent the truth from coming to light. The defense's closing argument lasted 45 minutes and consisted primarily of technical challenges to the chain of evidence in attempts to separate Connor Hartwell from his father's crimes through arguments about individual responsibility and the passage of time. The attorney was competent and thorough, but he was defending a case where the evidence was overwhelming and the moral questions were unambiguous. You cannot convict Connor Hartwell for crimes committed by his father in 1954, the defense attorney told the jury. You can only convict him for actions that he personally took with criminal intent. The prosecution has failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that my client committed any of the crimes charged in the indictment. But the prosecution had proven exactly that, with audio recordings of Connor discussing the concealment of evidence, financial records showing his knowledge of how the family fortune had been acquired, and testimony from multiple witnesses about his systematic efforts to prevent the truth from emerging through intimidation and violence. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with verdicts that sent Connor Hartwell to federal prison for the rest of his natural life, guilty on all 43 counts, with a recommendation that he serve consecutive rather than concurrent sentences. The judge accepted the recommendation and imposed a sentence of life without possibility of parole, plus 425 years. As Connor Hartwell was led away in shackles, he turned back to look at Cole and Elena with an expression that might have been hatred or might have been the kind of desperate incomprehension that comes from discovering that the rules you thought governed the world had never actually existed. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Agent Stone approached Cole and Elena in the courthouse hallway with the kind of carefully controlled expression that suggested he was about to deliver news that would change everything they thought they knew about the case. "There's something else," Stone said, pulling out a manila envelope. "We ran DNA tests on Connor Hartwell as part of the standard processing procedures. The lab also tested samples from the remains in the bunker to help with victim identification." Elena felt her breath catch. "What did you find?" "Connor Hartwell shares 50% DNA markers with one of the victims, Miguel Ruiz." Stone's words fell into the corridor like stones into still water, creating ripples that would reach far beyond this moment. Connor Hartwell is Miguel Ruiz's great-grandson. The information hit Elena like a physical blow. She sat down heavily in one of the courthouse chairs, the photograph of her grandfather still clutched in her hand. "That's impossible. Miguel never had children in America. He was only married to my grandmother." "The DNA doesn't lie," Stone said gently. "Our investigation suggests that Miguel had a relationship with someone at the ranch before he was murdered, a woman named Helen Morrison, who later became Helen Hartwell when she married Victor Hartwell in 1955. Cole felt the pieces of a 70-year-old puzzle suddenly arranging themselves into a picture that was both horrifying and tragically clear. Victor Hartwell's wife had a child by one of the Mexican workers he murdered. Connor Hartwell was born in March of 1955, 9 months after Miguel Ruiz died in that bunker. Victor Hartwell raised him as his own son, but Connor was actually the child of one of his father's murder victims. Stone's voice carried the weight of revelation that transformed everything they thought they understood about the case. Elena looked at the photograph of her grandfather with new eyes, seeing in Miguel's features the genetic inheritance that had been passed down through 3 generations to the man who had just been convicted of protecting the secret of his own grandfather's murder. "Does Connor know?" "We'll find out tomorrow. His attorney has requested a private meeting to discuss new information that might affect sentencing. I suspect Connor Hartwell is about to learn that he spent his entire life protecting the man who murdered his real grandfather." The irony was devastating and complete. Connor Hartwell had devoted his life to preserving Victor Hartwell's legacy and protecting the family empire, never knowing that Victor had murdered Connor's actual grandfather and stolen the identity of Connor's real heritage. The man Connor had revered as his father had destroyed Connor's true family and then raised Connor to be grateful for the privilege. Elena was crying now, but her tears seemed to carry both grief and something that might have been relief. Miguel did have a great-grandson. He had family he never knew about, and that family survived even though he didn't. "There's more," Stone continued. "Helen Morrison Hartwell left a letter to be opened after her death. She died in 1998, but the letter was sealed with instructions that it only be opened if Connor was ever arrested for crimes related to the 1954 murders. Her attorney turned it over to us yesterday. He handed Elena a photocopy of a handwritten letter dated 1997, the careful script of an elderly woman unburdening herself of a secret she had carried for 43 years. To whoever reads this letter, the document began, "My name is Helen Morrison Hartwell, and I have a confession to make. In 1954, I was 19 years old and working as a cook at the Hartwell Ranch. I fell in love with a Mexican worker named Miguel Ruiz, who was kind and gentle and treated me with more respect than I had ever received from any American man." Elena read aloud with a voice that shook with the weight of discovering family history that had been buried for 70 years. "When I discovered I was pregnant with Miguel's child, I told him immediately. He was overjoyed and began making plans to marry me and bring his wife from Mexico to help raise our baby. But Victor Hartwell overheard our conversation and flew into a rage. He said he would not have Mexican bastards born on his property and that Miguel would pay for compromising a white woman." The letter continued with details that filled in the missing pieces of a story that had taken 70 years to complete. Victor locked Miguel in the bunker with the other workers who had been causing problems. He told me that Miguel would be released if I agreed to marry Victor and raise the child as his own. He said if I refused, Miguel would die along with all the others. I was young and frightened, and I believed Victor when he said he would let Miguel go if I cooperated. Elena's voice broke as she read the next paragraph. Victor lied. He murdered Miguel and 62 other innocent men, then forced me to marry him and pretend that Connor was his son. I have lived with this secret for 43 years, watching my boy grow up believing that his father was a hero instead of the monster who killed his real grandfather. If Connor is reading this, I want him to know that Miguel Ruiz loved him before he was born and would have been proud of the man he became. The letter was signed Helen Morrison Hartwell and notarized with the kind of legal formality that suggested she had understood the importance of documenting truth, even when it was too dangerous to reveal. Connor Hartwell spent his entire life protecting the man who murdered his grandfather and stole his identity, Cole said, understanding finally why Raymond Brennan had been so specific about leaving the evidence for Cole to find. No wonder my grandfather felt guilty. He helped Victor Hartwell destroy Connor's real family and create the lie that Connor has been living his entire life. Agent Stone nodded with the satisfied expression of someone who had finally seen all the pieces of a complex puzzle fall into place. We'll be meeting with Connor and his attorney tomorrow morning to share this information. It won't change his conviction or his sentence, but it might help him understand why his life took the shape it did. Elena was staring at the photograph of Miguel Ruiz with tears streaming down her face. But now they were tears of something that looked like joy mixed with 70 years of accumulated grief. "Carlos and Sophia have a cousin they never knew about," she said. "Miguel's great-grandson is alive, and his name is Connor Hartwell, and he's going to spend the rest of his life in prison for protecting the man who murdered the grandfather he never got to know." The courthouse was emptying around them as evening approached, but Cole and Elena remained in the hallway with Agent Stone, processing information that transformed their understanding of everything that had happened over the past year. Justice had been served, but it had come with the kind of cruel irony that seemed to summarize everything tragic and complicated about the case. Connor Hartwell had inherited wealth, status, and the burden of protecting secrets that had destroyed his real family before he was born. He had lived his entire life as the unwitting guardian of his own grandfather's grave, never knowing that the empire he was protecting had been built on the bones of the man whose blood ran in his veins. Tomorrow, Connor Hartwell would learn that the father he had revered was actually his grandfather's murderer, and that the Mexican workers he had spent his life dismissing as criminals had included the grandfather who would have loved him. It was a revelation that would either destroy him completely or finally set him free from the lies that had shaped his entire existence. Either way, the truth was finally complete, and Miguel Ruiz's great-grandson would finally know the identity of the man whose DNA he carried and whose dreams he had unknowingly inherited, along with the fortune built on his grandfather's grave. 2 years after Connor Hartwell's conviction, Cole Brennan stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed visitor center, watching the sun rise over the mesa where 63 men had finally found their way home. The memorial had been completed 6 months earlier, its black granite walls etched with names in Spanish and English, birth dates and hometown locations, the careful record of lives that had been erased from official history but preserved in the memories of people who had never stopped believing that truth would eventually surface. The Brennan Ranch had been transformed into something Raymond could never have imagined when he'd sealed that bunker in 1954. Where once there had been silence and secrecy, now there were guided tours and educational programs and school groups learning about the human cost of treating other people's lives as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of wealth. The bunker itself had been preserved exactly as Cole and Elena had found it, a concrete tomb that now served as testimony to the possibility that buried truth could still find its way to light. Cole wore the uniform of a National Park Service ranger, his badge and name tag marking his transformation from broken-down Marine to keeper of historical memory. The job paid $52,000 a year, enough to cover his modest expenses and child support payments. But it came with something more valuable than money: the knowledge that he was spending his days honoring the dead rather than running from the ghosts that had haunted his nights since Iraq. His PTSD hadn't disappeared with the completion of justice for the murdered workers, but it had changed character, becoming something he could manage rather than something that controlled him. The nightmares still came occasionally, but now they were more likely to feature Raymond Brennan finding peace than Connor Hartwell escaping justice. Jennifer had driven down from San Antonio the previous evening with Lily, who was now 14 and possessed of the kind of fierce moral clarity that seemed to be standard equipment for teenagers who had grown up understanding that adults were capable of both extraordinary evil and extraordinary courage. The girl had spent the summer working as a volunteer at the memorial, leading tours for visitors who wanted to understand how systematic murder had been disguised as legitimate business for 70 years. "Dad!" Lily called out from the path leading up to the observation deck, her voice carrying the kind of excitement that suggested she had news worth sharing. "Dr. Ruiz just got here with Carlos and Sophia, and she brought someone you need to meet." Cole turned to see Elena approaching with her children, but they were accompanied by an elderly woman who moved with the careful dignity of someone whose body had aged beyond her spirit's willingness to accept limitations. The woman was perhaps 80 years old, with silver hair and dark eyes that seemed familiar in a way that suggested genetic inheritance rather than personal acquaintance. "Mr. Brennan," Elena said as the group reached the observation deck, "I'd like you to meet Carmen Ruiz Morales, my grandmother, Miguel's wife." Cole felt his breath catch as he realized he was looking at the woman who had waited 70 years for her husband to come home from America, who had raised their daughter alone while refusing to believe that 18-year-old Miguel had simply chosen to abandon his family without explanation. Carmen Ruiz Morales had lived long enough to see justice done, to learn the truth about what had happened to the boy she had married just weeks before he'd left for Texas in search of better wages and a better future. "Senora Morales," Cole said, extending his hand with the kind of respect that transcended language barriers, "it's an honor to meet you." Carmen took his hand in both of hers, her skin soft with age but her grip still strong with the determination that had carried her through 7 decades of unanswered questions. When she spoke, it was in heavily accented English that suggested she had been practicing what she wanted to say. "You are the man who opened the door," she said, her voice carrying across the years like a prayer finally answered. "You are the man who brought my Miguel home." "I just did what my grandfather should have done 70 years ago," Cole replied. But Carmen was already shaking her head with the gentle authority of someone who had lived long enough to understand the difference between what should have happened and what actually did happen. "Your grandfather was young and afraid. You were not young, but you were brave. That makes all the difference in the world." Elena had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke with the voice of someone who had spent 2 years learning to carry her family's story without being crushed by its weight. "Abuela wanted to see the memorial before the dedication ceremony this afternoon. She's 92 years old, and this is the first time she's left Mexico since Miguel died." The memorial occupied the space where the bunker had been discovered, its black granite walls rising from the desert floor like a natural formation that had been carved by wind and time rather than human hands. The names were arranged chronologically by age, starting with the youngest victim, a 16-year-old boy named Pablo Contreras, and ending with the oldest, a 48-year-old man named Eduardo Vasquez, who had left behind 7 children and a wife who died in 1987, still believing he would someday return. Carmen walked slowly along the memorial walls, her fingers tracing names with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. When she reached Miguel's name, she stopped and placed both hands flat against the stone, her lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been the kind of conversation that transcends the barriers between the living and the dead. Mijo, she whispered, and the Spanish endearment seemed to hang in the desert air like incense. I never stopped believing you would come home. Not the way I hoped, but home nonetheless. Carlos had grown into a young man who looked exactly like the photograph Elena had been carrying for 2 years. And now he stood beside his great-grandmother with the kind of protective attention that suggested he understood the weight of the moment. Bisabuela, tell Mr. Brennan about the letters. Carmen reached into her purse and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in tissue paper, handling it with the care usually reserved for precious manuscripts or irreplaceable photographs. Inside the paper were 47 letters, each one written in Miguel's careful handwriting, each one a window into the hopes and dreams of an 18-year-old man who had believed that hard work in America would provide the foundation for a better life. He wrote to me every week, Carmen said, offering the letters to Cole with the trust of someone sharing sacred relics. About the ranch, about the other workers, about the money he was saving for our future. The last letter came on June 14, 1954. He said there were problems with the working conditions, that the men were talking about contacting the government for help. Cole accepted the letters with the understanding that he was being entrusted with something more valuable than historical artifacts. These were the last words of a murdered man, the final testimony of someone who had died believing that justice existed and that American institutions could be trusted to protect the weak from the powerful. The last letter, Carmen continued, Miguel wrote that he was afraid something was going to happen to him. He said if anything did happen, I should remember that he loved me and our daughter more than his own life, and that he had tried to do the right thing even when the right thing was dangerous. Elena had been recording this conversation on her phone, understanding that her grandmother's words needed to be preserved as part of the historical record, but also recognizing that this might be the last time Carmen would be strong enough to tell Miguel's story in her own voice. Abuela, Elena said gently, there's something else you need to know, something we discovered during the trial. Carmen looked up at her granddaughter with the patient attention of someone who had survived 92 years by learning to accept whatever truth the world chose to reveal. Miguel had a son in America, a baby he never knew about. Elena's voice carried the weight of revelation that had taken 2 years to fully understand. The woman he loved at the ranch, she was pregnant when he died. That baby grew up and had children of his own. Carmen's hands trembled as she processed this information, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. A son? Miguel had a son? A great-grandson, actually. His name is Connor, and he's been in prison since the trial ended. He never knew Miguel was his great-grandfather until the DNA test revealed the truth. The old woman sat down heavily on one of the memorial benches, the weight of this revelation combining with 92 years of accumulated emotion. Connor Hartwell, the man who tried to keep the truth buried, the man who spent his entire life protecting the memory of Victor Hartwell, never knowing that Victor had murdered his real great-grandfather and stolen his true heritage, Elena explained. Connor thought he was defending his father's legacy, but he was actually preserving the lie that destroyed his own family. Carmen was quiet for a long time, her eyes fixed on Miguel's name carved into the black granite that would outlast everyone currently alive to remember him. When she finally spoke, it was with the voice of someone who had spent 92 years learning to forgive the unforgivable. Miguel's great-grandson is in prison? For the rest of his life, Cole said. But he knows the truth now. He knows who his real great-grandfather was, and he knows that Miguel died trying to do the right thing. I want to see him, Carmen said simply. I want to tell him about Miguel. I want him to know that his great-grandfather was a good man who would have loved him. The dedication ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon, timed to coincide with the moment when the sun would be directly overhead and the memorial walls would cast their shadows in perfect symmetry across the desert floor. Cole had been asked to speak at the ceremony, but he had declined, understanding that the day belonged to the families of the victims rather than to the man who had simply opened a door that should have been opened decades earlier. Instead, the keynote address was delivered by Elena, who had spent 2 years researching the lives and stories of all 63 men and could speak about each one as an individual human being rather than as a statistical entry in a historical tragedy. She spoke for 20 minutes, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd of family members, government officials, journalists and tourists who had come to witness the formal dedication of a memorial to forgotten lives. Miguel Ruiz was 18 years old when he died, she began, standing at a podium that had been positioned so that her words would carry toward the memorial walls where the names waited in their granite silence. Pablo Contreras was 16. Eduardo Vasquez was 48 and had 7 children waiting for him to return home. These were not statistics. These were human beings with families and dreams and the same right to life that we claim for ourselves. She paused to let her words settle into the silence before continuing with the kind of moral authority that comes from having spent years speaking for people who can no longer speak for themselves. For 70 years, their deaths were hidden by people who believed that money gave them the right to treat other human beings as disposable property. For 70 years, their families wondered what had happened to sons and fathers and husbands who had simply vanished without explanation. Today, we remember their names. Today, we acknowledge their humanity. Today, we promise that their deaths were not meaningless and their lives are not forgotten. Agent Marcus Stone had driven down from San Antonio for the ceremony, bringing with him news about ongoing investigations into other sites where Bracero workers had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The FBI had identified 17 ranches across Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, where similar patterns of worker disappearances had been reported, and federal teams were beginning archaeological surveys that might reveal additional burial sites. The Brennan Ranch investigation opened a door to understanding systematic abuse of the Bracero program that was much more widespread than anyone had realized. Stone told Cole, as they watched Elena finish her remarks to sustained applause from an audience that included family members who had traveled from across Mexico and the American Southwest to attend the ceremony. How many more sites are you looking at? 17 confirmed, with another 34 under preliminary investigation. Conservative estimates suggest we're looking at potentially 400 to 500 additional victims across a network of ranches that were systematically murdering workers and collecting government payments under false pretenses. Stone's expression carried the weight of someone who had discovered that a single case of historical injustice was actually the visible edge of something much larger and more systematic. The afternoon stretched toward evening with the slow inevitability of desert time, and gradually the crowd began to disperse, families and officials and journalists making their way back to parking areas, in hotel rooms, and flights that would carry them back to lives that had been touched but not transformed by their encounter with historical truth. But Carmen Ruiz Morales remained beside the memorial wall, her hand resting on Miguel's name, as if she were reluctant to break a connection that had taken 70 years to establish. Cole approached her as the sun was beginning to drop toward the horizon, understanding that this might be the last time the old woman would be strong enough to make such a journey. At 92, she was living on borrowed time, sustained by determination and the knowledge that she had finally learned the truth about what had happened to the boy she had married in the spring of 1954. "Senora Morales," he said gently, "would you like me to arrange for you to visit Connor in federal prison? I think Agent Stone could make that possible." Carmen looked up at him with eyes that held 7 decades of accumulated wisdom, the kind of understanding that comes from living long enough to see justice delayed but not denied. "Yes, I want him to know that Miguel would have been proud of the baby he never got to meet. I want him to know that family is stronger than the lies people tell to destroy it." Elena appeared at her grandmother's elbow with the gentle attention of someone who had spent 2 years learning to balance respect for the past with responsibility for the future. "Abuela, are you ready to go? Carlos and Sofia are waiting by the car." "Almost, Mia. I need to tell Miguel about his great-grandson." Carmen turned back to the memorial wall and placed her forehead against her husband's name, her lips moving in what sounded like Spanish, but might have been the kind of private language that develops between people who love each other beyond the boundaries of time and death. "Miguel, tu bisnieto está vivo. He carries your blood and your courage, even though he never knew your name. I will tell him about you, about us, about the love that created him before you died. Your family survived, mijo. Your dreams survived. Ya puedes descansar en paz. Miguel, your great-grandson is alive. I will tell him about you, about us, about the love that created him before you died. Your family survived, my son. Your dreams survived. Now you can rest in peace." When she finally stepped back from the memorial wall, Carmen Ruiz Morales looked like someone who had completed a journey that had taken her entire adult life to finish. The weight of 70 years of unanswered questions had lifted from her shoulders, replaced by the peace that comes from finally understanding that love can survive death and truth can survive burial. As the three generations of Miguel Ruiz's family made their way back to the parking area, Cole remained beside the memorial wall as darkness settled over the desert and solar-powered lights embedded in the granite began to glow with soft illumination that would keep the names visible throughout the night, a symbolic promise that these men would never again be forgotten or ignored. Jennifer and Lily had been waiting by Cole's Park service truck, and now they approached with the kind of careful attention that suggested they understood the emotional weight of the day and wanted to respect it without being excluded from it. "How are you holding up?" Jennifer asked, and her voice carried the warmth of someone who had learned to separate Cole's personal struggles from his commitment to doing right by the dead. "Better than I expected," Cole replied, and realized that he meant it. The ceremony had been emotionally draining, but it had also been emotionally healing in ways he was still learning to understand. "It feels like something important got finished today." Lily had been quiet during the ceremony, but now she spoke with the insight that seemed to be standard equipment for teenagers who had grown up around adults dealing with complicated questions of justice and responsibility. "Do you think Connor Hartwell understands now about his real family?" Cole considered the question, while looking toward the mesa where his grandfather had spent 70 years maintaining a secret that had slowly eaten away at his soul. Connor Hartwell was serving multiple life sentences in federal prison, but he had finally learned the truth about his heritage and his grandfather Miguel's courage. "I think understanding might be the only thing that saves him," Cole said finally. "He spent 64 years living a lie, but now he knows who he really is. That's a kind of freedom, even if it comes with prison bars." 6 months later, Cole stood in the visiting room of the Federal Correctional Institution in Beaumont, Texas, watching Carmen Ruiz Morales meet her step-great-grandson for the first time. Connor Hartwell looked older than his 64 years, his silver hair now completely white and his expensive clothes replaced by orange prison garb. But when Carmen placed her weathered hand on the glass partition and began to speak to him in Spanish, in broken English, about Miguel Ruiz, something changed in his face. For the first time since Cole had met him, Connor Hartwell looked like a human being, rather than a calculating machine designed to protect wealth and status. Tears streamed down his face as Carmen showed him the 47 letters Miguel had written to his wife, describing his hopes for the future and his love for the child he would never meet. "Your great-grandfather was a brave man who died trying to protect his fellow workers," Carmen told Connor through the prison phone system. "He would have loved you, mijo. He would have been proud of the man you could have become if you had known the truth." Connor listened without speaking, his eyes fixed on the photograph of Miguel Ruiz that Carmen held up to the glass. When she finished speaking, he was quiet for a long time, processing information that reframed his entire existence. "I'm sorry," he said finally, and his voice carried the weight of someone discovering that the foundation of his life had been built on lies and murder. "I'm sorry for what Victor did to him. I'm sorry for what I did to his family. I'm sorry for all of it." Carmen nodded with the infinite patience of someone who had spent 92 years learning to forgive the unforgivable. "Miguel forgives you, mijo, and I forgive you. Now you must learn to forgive yourself and find a way to honor his memory from wherever you are." The visit lasted 2 hours, and when it was over, Connor Hartwell looked like a different person than the man who had been led into the visiting room in shackles. He had finally learned who he really was, and with that knowledge came the possibility of redemption, even within the confines of federal prison. Cole drove Carmen back to the memorial that evening, and they sat together on one of the benches as the desert settled into its familiar nighttime rhythm. The solar lights cast soft shadows across the granite walls, and the names seemed to glow with their own internal illumination against the star-filled sky. "He understood," Carmen said simply. "Miguel's great-grandson finally understands who he is and where he comes from. That's enough. That's all any of us can hope for." Later that evening, after Carmen had flown back to Mexico and the memorial had settled into silence, Cole walked out to Miguel Ruiz's name one final time. He placed his hand flat against the stone, feeling the smooth coolness of granite that would outlast everyone currently alive to remember the 18-year-old who had died believing in justice, even when justice seemed impossible. "Your family knows the truth now," Cole said, speaking to the darkness in the desert and the possibility that the dead could still hear words spoken with sufficient conviction. "Your great-grandson knows who you were and what you stood for. Carmen got to tell him about your love and your courage. Your story isn't ending in that bunker anymore. It's continuing in the people who carry your blood and your dreams." The wind picked up, carrying familiar scents across the memorial site and rustling through the trees that had been planted to provide shade for visitors during the heat of summer days. In that sound, Cole imagined he could hear voices speaking in Spanish and English, the multilingual chorus of men who had died far from home but had finally found their way back to the light. He remained at the memorial until well past midnight, keeping watch over names that would never again be forgotten or ignored, understanding that he had become exactly what Raymond Brennan had hoped he would become, the last keeper of a truth that had taken 70 years to surface and would now be preserved for as long as human beings valued justice over comfort and truth over convenience. Behind him, the solar lights continued their quiet vigil, keeping the names visible throughout the long desert night, a promise that some stories are too important to be forgotten and some truths are too valuable to remain buried forever. The circle was complete, the debts had been paid, and Miguel Ruiz's great-grandson finally knew the name of the man whose dreams he had unknowingly inherited, along with the burden of preserving his memory.